History is articulated through landscape. And Manitoulin Island, also known as Minidominis, is also known as Spirit Island, but also Odawa-Minis is the place of the Odawa, being the traditional territory of the Odawa Anishinaabe. There's rich oral histories around underwater beings that occupy the surrounding area of Manitoulin Island. There's oral histories of underwater tunnels that connect to certain places. The name itself, Manitoulin, comes from Nidoning, which is the Anishinaabe pronunciation of Manitwaning. Manitwaning is the anglicized pronunciation of Nidoning, and that means the den of the spirit, so the place where the spirit presents itself.
The village of Sheguiandah looks like many other rural communities at first glance, except for an unusual knoll of quartzite rock on the outskirts of town, rising more than 100 feet above the nearby waters of Sheguiandah Bay. Rediscovered in modern times by archaeologist Thomas Lee in 1951, this rare quartzite outcropping makes Sheguiandah one of the most interesting archaeological sites in all the world, and also one of the least understood.
So we're here at the start of the trail, the historic trail to the Sheguiandah Archaeological Site, and it is a National Historic Site, as we mentioned. This trail that you're going to be walking on goes several hundred meters up the hill, and we'll be stopping at about 10 different points along the way. So here we are at the first stop, or maybe the second stop, on this historic walking tour. This is all about the ancient beach terraces on Manitoulin Island and the Sheguiandah site. And as I mentioned earlier, as we go up the hill, we'll be essentially walking back in time. So we're starting out down here at Sheguiandah Bay, Lake Huron, and right now we're nearly at the Algoma level, which is only maybe about 20 meters above normal. And then we'll be going up to the Nipissing and the Cora. This is the top of the hill. So we're only going to be going halfway up all of the various beach ridges on Manitoulin. But this is a kind of a way of geologically dating the sites and the people that lived on them.
Long before modern technology and farming practices made hunting unnecessary for most people in this part of the world, ancient peoples relied on one simple skill to stay alive: the ability to create and use sharp-edged tools made of stone. For thousands of years, stone arrowheads, spear points, knives, and scrapers were as essential for life as cars and grocery stores are today. Paleo-Indians made and used these items not just to hunt animals, but to scrape hides clean to use for clothing and shelter, to cut up meat after making a kill, and to defend themselves against enemies. But making sharp-edged tools and weapons by hand using only what nature provides isn't easy. Only a few kinds of rock in the world have the right properties to be chipped into sharp, blade-like shapes that hold an edge and resist shattering. The quartzite knoll at Sheguiandah is one of the very best for this application, and it's astonishingly rare. That's why ancient peoples traveled to this site and used it for at least 450 generations. Most of the bedrock in the Sheguiandah area, and all of Manitoulin Island in fact, is dolomite, a sedimentary rock similar to limestone. Dolomite is completely useless for making weapons and edge tools, and this is why Sheguiandah, with its astonishingly pure quartzite outcropping, was such a valuable spot in ancient times. No doubt skilled toolmakers from miles around came to the knoll to make tools for themselves and as trade goods, leaving a long, rich record going back into antiquity. Most of the local quartzite is encased far beneath the soil and dolomite bedrock of the modern-day landscape and is quite inaccessible. But in Sheguiandah, things are different. Thanks to a chance ripple in the rock when it first formed from liquid magma, a hillock of quartzite pokes up through the surface where it's completely exposed. Millennia ago, when humans first discovered this outcropping, it changed everything for one simple reason. Sheguiandah quartzite has just the right high silica content that allows it to be chipped in predictable and extremely sharp ways.
So Manitoulin geology is basically dolomite and limestones, and so it would be much younger than the quartzite. This is called Sheguiandah quartzite, but geologically it's the Bar River Formation. It's also special in that it's been recrystallized. So sometime this is really old rock, 1.3 billion years old, and it's surrounded by rock that's a few 100 million years old, but it got distorted and twisted and pushed, and it's made more glassy, so it fractures better and more consistently. So we're here at the Algoma level now. We're at what they consider to be the middle woodland level. This would be about 2,000 years old. The water would be right at the foot of this little ridge at that time. And during that period, the middle woodland people lived in this area and all across the region. So we find sites in places like Killarney, elsewhere on Manitoulin, all across this part of Canada. The Anishinaabe people lived in wigwams. They made pottery, so this is the first appearance of clay pots around that time. Now this particular installation just recognizes the indigenous use of plants. Virtually all plants were used for medicines, for materials, for cordages. This plant can be used to make rope and twine and various other kinds of useful materials. So if you want to string up a deer, you could take the bark and braid it together. This is something called Dirca. It's not a widespread plant, but it's a very useful plant. Here you see an archer. Bows and arrows were important. Dirca could be used to make bowstrings. So we're proceeding up a slope here that is part of the Nipissing Beach, and there are many boulders, water-washed boulders on the ground here. The whitish-grayish ones are quartzite. This particular quartzite would not be that useful for making artifacts because it's been pretty heavily weathered. But as we go up, you'll start to see pieces that have been worked, that have flakes taken off. And if you were to move the leaves, you'd see artifacts such as the flake I showed you just lying on the ground. So you'll get a very rounded boulder or cobble that makes it more difficult to knock a flake off. So it's harder to, I guess, the flakes are taken off with hammerstones or antler billets, moose antler, and these rounded pieces are harder to chip. But see, some of these pieces appear to have been flaked, you know, they do have fresher surfaces on them. We'll get some better examples as we go up the hill here. So here at this terrace, this is the Nipissing Beach Terrace. This is a beach cut by waves about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. And it's quite a prominent terrace. If we were to look on a geological map, it makes quite a pronounced feature. The contour lines are very close here, which depict this very steep rise as we're going to be going up. And around that time, around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, the archaeological culture was the Archaic, or the Shield Archaic. In some places they called it the Laurentian Archaic, down towards the St. Lawrence. But it was a bit different in the sense that these Anishinaabe people did not use pottery. Pottery hadn't appeared yet. They did use groundstone tools, so they had big axes and gouges, and we do find some of those around. They appear to have been using them to make dugout canoes, so maybe the dugout canoes were more common than the later birch bark canoes. So lying around on the ground here is a lot of quartzite artifacts, and you may wonder, how do you know it's an artifact? Well, it's freshly flaked. There's a spot here called a striking platform where you can see where it's been hit, and it's has this little secondary scar here. Quartzite it's silica. It's like 98%, 99% silica, and it breaks just like glass. So when a stone hits your windshield, you may see a little kind of a dimple. That cone is the same as this circle here. So it follows the same principles of the breaking of any brittle solid.
In 1951, archaeologist Thomas Lee happened to be driving through the outskirts of the Sheguiandah village with his field assistant, Doug Bell. He'd been hired by the Archaeological Survey of Canada to travel around Ontario documenting archaeological sites connected to the Bruce Peninsula area of the province. That's what led Lee to Manitoulin. It's the northern extent of a long spine of sedimentary rock that runs up the lower part of Ontario, a formation called the Niagara Escarpment. Glancing to one side as he drove, Lee spotted what appeared to be hundreds of deliberately shaped quartzite shards in a farmer's field. This field bordered the northern face of the quartzite hillock that would later be known as the Sheguiandah Archaeological Site. Jumping out of his vehicle to examine the rocks more closely, Lee realized they were indeed shaped by human hands. What he had stumbled upon was a large collection of what the archaeological community calls bifaces, stone fragments intentionally chipped and shaped on at least two different sides. Filled with enthusiasm at his discovery, Lee and his team began a full-fledged archaeological investigation of the site, with help from the Ontario Archaeological Society in the following year, 1952. Lee quickly discovered stunning, rich deposits of quartzite arrow points, spearheads, scraping tools, and other artifacts, including chips and flakes discarded during thousands of years of continuous primitive quarrying. Lee meticulously cleaned, categorized, and photographed the artifacts, some of which are still on display today in the Centennial Museum of Sheguiandah.
We knew why he was here. He was very outspoken to my dad about what was going on, but they had quite an encampment of tents at what is now the government dock was then too. There was a big clearing there, and there was a lot of university students came to do the dig.
Deeply concerned about the open site being looted, Thomas Lee lobbied hard to have it protected. In 1953, the Ontario government created the Archaeological and Historic Sites Protection Act, which made it illegal to disturb the site unless authorized to investigate it.
We're here on a ridge, a geological ridge, near the top of the hill at the Sheguiandah site. It was designated the Mystic Ridge by Tom Lee. He didn't really know exactly why this ridge was here. He thought originally maybe it had been built by the ancient inhabitants, because we know that elsewhere in North America, earthworks and mounds of considerable size have been made by Middle Woodland people. So he called it the Mystic Ridge, but if you look at the ridge itself, it's shown in here. It kind of drapes around the hill. It goes down. It doesn't follow the contour lines very well. And that suggests that it's actually bedrock. And if you dig into it, we dug into it in 1990 when we were here. And at the core of it, it is an Ordovician deposit. It was an Ordovician beach around 500 to 600 million years old. And it has particular fossils in it. Conodonts, the teeth of ancient critters, can be found in this deposit as well. So at that time, there was high water, and the Mystic Ridge is this little remnant here that was not eroded away. And this red stuff here, that depicts the quartzite hill or mountain that we're going to be going up as we proceed. Now the next area we're going into here is designated the habitation area, because there are many tools found in this area that would be used in a normal habitation setting. Scrapers, knives, such types of tools. At this particular location, it is called a habitation area because that's what Tom Lee called it, and this is where he did most of his excavations. You can see these rows of stones here. He marked out the squares that he dug. In those days, they used to dig 10-foot by 10-foot squares. Typically, archaeologists will put down a datum rod or something to mark where they dug. But in this particular place, Tom Lee laid down quartzite boulders to mark the spots. This would be 1950, 51, 52 is when he dug in this area. You can see artifacts all over the ground. But much of what was going on up here was the manufacture of things called bifaces. A biface is a stone artifact that's flaked on both faces. This is dirty on the back, but you can see that it's been chipped to form kind of a lozenge, or almost like the shape of your hand. And these artifacts, but some that would be more precisely made, this is a reject. This was left behind, so it's not quite as good as some. Thousands and thousands of these things were manufactured, and then as they travel across the landscape, they may cache some of these, they may take them with them, and then you can flake them a little bit more and make spear points, as we'll be showing in the next slide or sign over there. But all over the ground you'll see flakes, flakes, flakes everywhere, and rejects. Many of these would break in manufacture, and so they'd just be left in the ground. A big issue about the Sheguiandah site was, how old is it? And if we dig down here, down a meter, we'll go through different layers of earth, right? And in the upper part, you have a typical forest soil. And then in the second layer here, this BW, you have a mixture of some bigger stones and some artifacts as well. And there's a few artifacts that are found way down a bit deeper, into like the fifth layer. How did they get there? Is this glacial till or not?
Lee returned to Sheguiandah to continue his archaeological excavation in 1953 and again in 1954. Although he was deeply passionate about discovering all Sheguindah's secrets, his work was prematurely halted in 1956 when he ran out of funding. Before being forced to stop work, Lee unearthed a handful of artifacts beneath a layer of soil he identified as glacial till. Glacial till is any unsorted sediment left behind by mile-thick glaciers as they slowly inched across the land during the ice ages, scraping, pushing, and churning up rocks, sand, soil, and anything else in its path. In the case of the Sheguiandah area, the last glaciation began roughly 20,000 to 25,000 years ago. Lee was convinced the soil he removed from above some of the artifacts was deposited by glaciers. If correct, this theory would mean the site had been used by humans for at least 20,000 years, making it one of the oldest archaeological discoveries in all of North America. Since Lee's investigation remained unfinished, the age of the site was never fully established among the archaeological community. Lee's assertion of pre-glacial human activity quickly became controversial, since some of Lee's peers felt the site wasn't nearly as old as Lee suggested. Despite mounting opposition to the 20,000-year hypothesis, Lee remained firm in his position until his death in 1982.
The site has been controversial over the years. It was claimed to be a pre-Clovis site. Clovis is a Paleo-Indian culture from about 12,000 to 14,000 years. But the original excavator, Tom Lee and his crew, dug here for a few years, and they believe they found artifacts in mixed deposits and in layers that were thought to be glacial till. So that, in their interpretation, meant that the site was used and tools were made and occupied prior to the last ice age. And that would make it, the site maybe 20,000 years old, or possibly older. In the 1950s, that's before we had radiocarbon dating, and so it was hard to really test that really accurately. They were basing it on the water levels in geology.
In 1991, nearly 4 decades after Lee's original excavation, and after extensive discussion with community leaders of the Sheguiandah First Nation, the Sucker Creek First Nation, since renamed Ondek Omni Canning, and Howland Township, a new archaeological dig began. The purpose was to finally put to rest the question of the age of the Sheguiandah site. Dr. Patrick Julig, an archaeologist and anthropology professor at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Canada, and fellow archaeologist Peter Stork, led a team of archaeologists and geologists in an investigation to re-examine the site, and specifically Thomas Lee's original and controversial assertions. Were humans actively using the Sheguiandah site 20,000 years ago and beyond?
They decided to retest that, to get somebody and go redig the site and try and figure out really how old this thing is. Other archaeologists thought it was more like 10,000 years old based on the kind of spear points and so forth.
After multiple, carefully planned excavations, Dr. Julig and his team concluded that Lee probably misread the archaeological clues left behind in the soil. The sediment Lee had believed to be glacial till was most likely soil left behind by far more recent flooding. Dr. Julig and his team concluded the site's age was likely closer to 10,000 years, around half of what Lee had estimated in the 1950s.
I got involved and a number of other people from Toronto, the ROM, and various geologists, and we redated it. We dug the same pits and came up with the radiocarbon date of about 10,000 years.
In the years since Dr. Julig's investigation, other archaeologists and geologists have examined the evidence. With few exceptions, they accept Dr. Julig's view as the most likely to be correct.
So we did some tests, and we see that some of these layers are stratified, meaning laid down by water. So if this is glacial till, then why would these be water-worn layers under here? That's one issue. Another thing we looked at is something called conjoinable artifacts. Artifacts get broken, and then if we dig them up and then see where they came out of and then glue them back together, if we find an artifact from up near the top that fits together with one down near the bottom, and they fit perfectly together, then the question is, how did they get apart that far? How did they get so far separated? Tom Lee was quite careful. He marked where the depths of the artifacts, where he found them, and we glue them back together, and we find that tree throws, that the ground has all been dug up. If you look over here, you see that big oak blew down about 10 years ago, and in the top of it you see artifacts all over the place, right? Flakes. And what has happened over the years is the ground has gotten churned up, and these pieces that used to fit together are now separated by maybe a meter in the ground due to by Mother Nature, by bioturbation. This tree throw here is a good natural example of what can happen as the tree tips up. Big chunks will get stirred up and then fall down into the pit and get further down. Others will end up high on top. So you may have some pieces that are way up there on the very top, a nice flake, that previously was way down. So it kind of gets mixed up by Mother Nature. And the few artifacts that we find that are way down, over a meter down, are often in the bottom of these sort of pits. 3 different explanations as to how old is the site, different interpretations. The regular archaeological one is that these earliest folks were called the Paleo-Indians. They came over from Asia via the Bering Land Bridge 13 to 15,000 years ago, and they spread across this area. Another view is a pre-Clovis hypothesis, and that Tom Lee believed in that. He thought there would be maybe 20, 25,000. There is some evidence for that in other sites. So we find sites in South America and in other places that are older than 13 or 14,000. So it does appear that it's partly correct, but not necessarily for here, because this would have been under ice and water. The third view is the view that many indigenous Anishinaabe people would say they've been here since time immemorial. They believe that they were created here in many cases.
The creation story, when Turtle Island was created, at one time in the beginning, this world, it was just always moving like a star. It was so the first helper Creator sent was Thunderbird. He sent Thunderbirds here to cool her off, and then she became what she is today. once that land was formed. So Turtle Island, it goes back to those animals in the beginning. They helped create part of that turtle. The turtle sacrificed himself by having that otter put that dirt on his back, and this part of the world, North America, grew from there. Everything was given to us from Creator. Everything we needed, but it was only half. That was the relationship. The other half was our responsibility to pick up what was given to us. Otherwise, we wouldn't survive if we didn't do anything.
Now here is one of the major pits that we re-excavated where Tom Lee claimed to have found glacial till. And when the glacier goes over the land, it tends to put marks on the rocks. Those are called glacial striations. And we had Peter Barnett, a geologist, look at the rocks at the base of this pit, and the striations were random. So there was no good evidence of glaciers moving southwest to northeast in this area.
Even assuming the more recent timeline put forth by Dr. Julig, artifacts at the Sheguiandah site are very old, spanning several eras and completely different cultures. What prompted the people to abandon the site and the stone tool making that happened there? Most likely obsolescence. As Anishinaabeg people gained access to iron-edged tools and weapons from Europeans, the relative value of stone tools declined. The last time quartzite was chipped and shaped in Sheguiandah was probably 300 or 400 years ago, just about the time that iron knives, tools, and guns became available as trade goods. Once the need for stone tools disappeared, Sheguiandah quartzite disappeared from human knowledge until the chance discovery by Thomas Lee in 1951. Despite tool-making activities spanning thousands of years in multiple cultures, all the people who worked Sheguiandah quartzite had several things in common. One was their great skill. Ancient toolmakers knew not only how to identify promising pieces of rock by sight, but were also extremely capable at chipping that rock into arrowheads, spearheads, butcher knives, hide scrapers, and other tools necessary for their way of life. The art of chipping stone into effective blades is called flint knapping, and it's only possible with a few minerals in the world. To be considered suitable for chipping to a sharp and useful edge, stone must be capable of splitting into sharp-edged shards at least twice as long as they are wide, all without shattering. Very few types of stone have this ability. Only flint, chert, obsidian, quartzite, and a few others are up to the task. For ancient peoples on and around Manitoulin Island, Sheguiandah quartzite was one of the few deposits of suitable raw material in the area that allowed them to live and thrive. It would have been known and visited by people from hundreds and perhaps even thousands of miles away.
This is an area that is completely covered with chips and blocks dug out 10,000 years ago or thereabouts, and it's the refuse of manufacturing, chipping, biface making. This area was a pasture for a while, and so there hasn't really been much soil deposited on here. It's pretty much all on the surface. So this is one of the unique things about the Sheguiandah site, is you have thousands and millions of artifacts lying around on the surface.
The art of flint knapping, the chipping of rocks to create razor-sharp cutting edges, has been all but lost. Only a small, dedicated handful of history enthusiasts have kept the ancient skill alive. Dr. Patrick Julig is among them.
So today we're looking at flint knapping, specifically making tools out of stone. And there's many different kinds of chert and flint and quartzite. All of these are silica-rich rocks that are essentially like glass. This is obsidian, which is another material that's used quite widely. And these are all about 99% silica, so they break like glass. And because they fracture in a predictable way, you can use hammerstones and moose antlers or billets and pressure to shape them in the way you like, into a desired form. That could be a spear point, a biface, a chopper. And this has been done for millions of years. And specifically here at Sheguiandah site, it goes back about 10,000 years. And the material that was used here was this high-grade Bar River Formation quartzite. It's a kind of sandstone that is quite homogeneous, and in its best facies over on the side of the hill where the trail is, some of it can be taken out in fairly big chunks, and it can be flaked and to make tools of various kinds. So today what we're going to do is just do a little bit of reproduction, tool reproduction, where we will try to make some stone tools and show how to break rocks, basically. We're leaning this block against my knee on this piece of rawhide here, and that kind of cushions the blow, hopefully to keep the flake from breaking into multiple pieces. Well, the flake came off, but it fractured. You can see the multiple fractures there. But the edges are extremely sharp. So that in itself, these fragments or flake fragments could be used to cut something. So for example, you could very easily skin an animal, or it's a, some of the flint, some of the rock is as sharp as a scalpel. So the obsidian flakes, the edge is actually sharper than a steel scalpel. So they do sometimes use stone blades for precision surgery. Let's try a different block and see if we can have better luck with getting a flake off here. A nice big flake. I'm just going to trim this a little bit. Take a few off. I'm just getting rid of the excess material and cleaning the edge a little bit here. The place that you strike it is known as a striking platform. It sometimes is useful to rough it up a little bit with a stone to prepare it. I got to move this in a little bit more, I think. Okay, so we're going to try and take another flake off here. Oh. No, these are all very fractured material, see there? So I'm not happy with that block either. Okay, well this gives you a little bit of an idea. You can get off a larger piece. Unfortunately, this didn't really go very far. But if you wanted to then do something with this, like turn it into, say, a hide scraper or something like that, the edge is a little bit too thin. Like you could use it to cut something, but for scraping it would be a little bit too weak. So what you do, oh, this is failing here. You can just sort of brush it almost, and you can see how the little flakes come off. Now this may seem like you'd be dulling it, but in fact you are moving the edge back a little bit and making it a little bit stronger. So if you were going to use this for a hide scraper, for example, and it got dull, you could continue to do this. You can just reshape it with the antler billet, just by brushing it. Let's have a look at this flake here. So this is a little bit better quality flake. So if I wanted to reshape this edge a little bit, so you can see I've taken a whole lot of little flakes off of there. And then this is now quite a robust edge for scraping hides or some types of needs. The antler billet is used for shaping the pieces. Now, if you wanted to take off really small flakes, then you can use a pressure flaker, something like this, and you can just simply push on it, and you could see that little flake came off there. Another one, right? So if you were shaping something into a really fine point, such as an arrowhead or something, the pressure flaker is the final tool that you use to complete that kind of a job. If you are working on really small pieces, like an arrow point, such as the ones in there, often you will hold it in your palm like this and press it this way. So you can see I'm able to shape it. Now the reason I rubbed it was to set up a few little sort of fracture lines in there, and then it's easier to flake. It sort of will start the breakage. So this is pressure flaking, and that would be to finish the tool. So if I was making an end scraper here, which is a very common tool found on archaeological sites, then that would be the way to reshape the end of it. So the rock breaks just the same as your windshield cracks if a stone hits it. There will be a cone of percussion that comes off of it, and it's predictable how it will break, and it's just the ancients learned that early on, going back several million years. We're here at the top of the mid-quarry ridge. There's a little bit of moss and lichen that has formed in this area, but you do see artifacts peeking out of the moss all over the place. This was a major area of quarrying and workshops for thousands of years. There's not very much tree growth in this area, so it's all on the ground. It's highly visible. Sometimes we can see places where quarrying occurred, where there's been bashing on the underlying bedrock to take out chunks. And in fact, there's a number of depressions as we go a little bit further along. These are swamps 1 through 4, large depressions. Some of them might be larger than several houses that have been actually chipped out of the ground. And we find that elsewhere in North America, sometimes pits the size of a city block where particularly good raw material was excavated. Here on the ground we have many chunks. Some of them were chipped and used and quarried out by Anishinaabe people, but some are just natural waste products. So if you dig out a good rock, you might remove 3 or 4 others. But here you can see where there's flake scars taken off. It's a fairly consistent piece, probably a flake scar there as well. But ultimately, this piece might not have been good enough to make a biface. It's a little bit too flawed, so it would have been rejected, along with thousands of others here. Tom Lee called this Swamp 1, and it's a depression in the hillside. He dug down into it, and it was completely had been quarried out. So this whole depression here is man-made. Often trees will bring up artifacts, and you can see here in this case where a tree the roots have been forcing artifacts up out of the ground, and so often at the base of trees you'll find a collection of artifacts in such a place. We're here at the hillside quarry location at the Sheguiandah Archaeological Site, and if you were to look in a book on Sheguiandah, this might be the depiction, this very spot. where there was a very large pit surrounded by many, many chips and so forth that Tom Lee excavated out, and this shows these original pictures. But over here you will see where the location was, and you can see how far down they dug into the ground 10,000 years ago to get good quality quartzite. So this is the main reason the site is designated, because you have an entire hillside, 25 acres or more, covered with artifacts just lying around on the ground that many of them have been there for twice as long as the Great Pyramid. So if the Great Pyramid was built 5,000, or Stonehenge 5,000 years ago, this is twice as old. We're now near the top of the hill here at the Sheguiandah Archaeological Historic Tour. This art installation depicts a carbon-14 atom. Now, why would we have physics up here on top of the hill? Well, to date the site we used carbon-14, and so I'll explain that a little more at the next installation up here. On the top of the hill there's a number of little swamps here, and as you know, as plants live and grow and die, they fall down into the water, or they accumulate in bogs, and so you get a layer of peat. And some of the little swamps here, we have 1 to 2 meters of peat. When Tom Lee originally dug the site, it was just at the beginning of carbon-14. He didn't really have the same tools we have now to be able to date things. But what we did is we dug down into the bogs and we redated the beginnings of plant life in this area. And that goes back about 10,000 years. And it shows it going from like an open woodland to spruce and into pine. Carbon-14 is a kind of an atomic clock that will record how long it's been since something died. And we pick up carbon-14, carbon-12, and carbon-13. There's 3 kinds of carbon, but the carbon-14 is unstable. It disappears over time. And it disappears at about half of it disappears over 5,000 years, roughly 4,500, so, or 5,700, sorry. And so it's a kind of an atomic clock, and it will tell us how old things are. And in the swamp right down here, you can see I'm down in a bog over further down than the top of the ground, and my trowel is pointing at the bottom of the first accumulation. And right there we start to find a few little artifacts, and that dates to around 9,500 roughly. And there are no artifacts further down in the clay till, but they start at that point. So that tells us that's when Anishinaabe people started to live around the edges of these bogs and chip stones, and the kids would be throwing stones in the pond, skipping stones like we do nowadays. And so part of the story and dating of the site goes back to physics, to carbon-14. It's one of many useful dating techniques that have been developed.
As I undertook my research for my master's degree, I asked the question about the place of archaeology in the community, from the community's perspective. And so I entered that research project as an applied anthropological research project that explored the feasibility of economic and tourism development. And so applied anthropology is this idea that you apply concepts and ideas that are in anthropology for a specific purpose. And so some of that includes archaeology as well. So I was interested in understanding how the community thought about investing in archaeology as a form of tourism and economic development. And I quickly found out that the archaeology of Sheguiandah is not as significant as is the historical relationship with the community and others who are in the vicinity, like settler Canadians, newcomers coming in, and also government. So when I started reaching out to community leaders and elders, I quickly found out that relationships was really what mattered for the community. So relationships with archaeologists, relationships with the discipline of archaeology. And what really came about in those consultations that I was undertaking was the work that was done with then Sucker Creek, now Omniconning, Howland Township, now northeastern Manitoulin and the Islands, and Sheguiandah. So they had a partnership. So the community's approach to things was articulated by way of these relationships that they had with their surrounding communities, with professionals by way of archaeology, and the history of that relationship. So it was more of a relationship perspective. And what came out of that was this idea that an Indigenous participation in these kinds of things is a metaphor of dispossession from representation of the past and even practicing a representation of the past, but also a dispossession of the landscape itself. So I was told of how the hilltop of where the site is located was a significant fasting area. So fasting camps would be held there. And when I had visited the site at one point in time through the purpose of doing my research, there was evidence that it had been used in the past as a fasting camp. So, there's some indication that there's this continuation of this cultural use of the site itself. So I found that the community is less interested about archaeology, but they're more interested in participating in their own representation. And the Sheguiandah site represents that opportunity to do so.
Today, the Sheguiandah site remains legally protected from both looting and development. Township leaders and Dr. Julig spearheaded efforts to make it more tourist-friendly, including the construction of a wooden boardwalk leading to the summit, where Thomas Lee made some of his most significant discoveries. Although it's unlikely the Sheguiandah archaeological site will ever again be relied on to provide the raw materials for creating tools crucial to human survival, there's still much it can teach us. One of the greatest lessons is that the land and its resources are a gift meant to be used, cherished, and never taken for granted. It's also vital to realize how far we've come and to never lose sight of where humanity began and how people can rise to challenges that seem impossible today. Perhaps most important of all, the Sheguiandah site reminds us that for the vast majority of human history, simple, practical tools and skills allowed people to survive, grow, and thrive. Physical records of people long past are rare in this world, and the Sheguiandah site is a window into humanity's past, to a simpler time when a few skillfully chipped shards of the right sort of stone kept humanity going.